Okay, so good afternoon everyone and welcome to today's lecture, Reflections on Zamboanga, War, Commerce, and Faith in the Spanish Frontier Region, 1635 to 1805. So this lecture explores historical development of Zamboanga during a crucial period of Spanish colonial expansion in the southern Philippines. Far from being a peripheral outpost, Zamboanga served as a strategic frontier where military campaigns, commercial networks, and religious missions intersected, shaping interactions among diverse communities across Mindanao and the wider maritime region. So through the lens of frontier history, today's discussion invites us to reconsider the complex social, political, and economic forces that influenced the region and contributed to broader patterns of exchange and state formation in Southeast Asia. So this lecture is organized by the UP Asian Center and in partnership with the UP Bangsamoro Studies Group. So let me just introduce the UP Bangsamoro Studies Group. So the UP BSG is a student-led organization that caters to UP students with strong interests in the Bangsamoro in the larger context of the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and the Global South under the guidance of Bangsamoro scholar Dr. Nasef Manabilang Adjong. They were founded in 2024 by undergraduate, graduate, and law students in UP Diliman. And the organization organizes educational forums, engagements on different issues facing the Bangsamoro as an evolving political cause rather than a static legal entity. And they are engaged in diverse partnerships with organizations and institutions within and beyond the university, such as the Bangsamoro Research and Legal Network, or the BRLN, MSU Tawi-Tawi, MSU Iligan, the UP Padayon Public Service Office, and Dulaang UP. So we are pleased to gather scholars, students, researchers, and guests for today's lecture, and thank you very much for joining us. So to formally open our program, it's my pleasure to invite the Dean of the UP Asian Center, Dean Noel Christian A. Moratilla, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Danae. Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Magandang araw. I'm actually rather surprised because I thought there would just be a few attendees, considering that it's already the semester break. But of course, I'm very grateful that we have a relatively big audience. I wish to welcome you all to the lecture that we're having this afternoon, entitled Reflections on Zamboanga, War, Commerce, and Faith in a Spanish Frontier Region. The lecture will look into how the peninsula served not only as a fulcrum of colonial power in the southern part of the archipelago. It was also a center of generally peaceful interactions between ethnicities and religions. This goes to show how certain stories from the past may be more complex than mainstream historical references would show, and this would therefore necessitate a sophisticated approach to unpeel the layers. Without necessarily sharing his cynicism towards history, I'd like to quote the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote, "History does not hand us objective, undeniable truths," end of quote. Instead, according to Nietzsche, history is like ancient oracles whose symbols may be vague and symbolic. This is the reason why research projects that provide various perspectives, at times conflicting, deserve to be listened to and read, and serve as prompts for academic conversations such as this. We're therefore fortunate to have with us today a scholar who, guided by the multifaceted character of the past, has chosen to investigate the intricate stories under the veneer of Spanish colonial history. As a research hub for advancing Philippine studies, which, in keeping with our multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary orientation, includes scholarship on the country's convoluted past, the Asian Center is always pleased to serve as host for the sharing of such insights. Allow me to end with lines from the poem of a Zamboanga native, the late writer Francis Santos, which I believe teaches us how the past is inextricable from the present. And I quote, "It appears we can no longer deny what the ancients said about the stars and ourselves, knowing as we do now that their rays reach us and subtly." End of quote. Indeed, the rays of the stars, that is the rays of the past, continue to reach us and subtly. Maraming po salamat and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dean Moratilla. And at this point, let me introduce the reason why we're all here today. So let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. So our speaker is a researcher at the Institute of History, Instituto de Historia, at the Spanish National Research Council, or Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas in Madrid, Spain. And he received his PhD from the University of Graz, Austria, completed postdoctoral work at the University of Hamburg, and has served as a visiting professor at the University of Hagen in Germany. So since 2016, he has been a member of the CSIC faculty, specializing in the Spanish presence in the Pacific, particularly the history of the Philippines during the 17th and 18th centuries. Our speaker has edited and published several works on the diplomatic, commercial, cultural, and political history of the Spanish Empire, and among his works are co-edited volume with Lola Elizalde, The Representation of External Threats from the Middle Ages to the Modern World, published by Brill. And his research focuses especially on the multifaceted contact zones in the southern Philippines, characterized by the complex and often fragile coexistence of Spaniards and the so-called Moros, a topic he has explored extensively in international journals and edited volumes. So, additionally, he investigates the Austrian and German consular presence in the Philippines during the 19th century. So, to bring us to Zamboanga, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Eberhard Crailshire.
Thank you very much. Let me please just check every technical instrument works here. It looks as, yeah, it works. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your kind words, your thoughtful reflections, the theme, the presentation and the organization of my meeting here. To Maria for the, what is it called, reactors, theme reactors. And of course to Aria Lopez as well, who is not here unfortunately, but who is connected to the Asian Center. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say I've done some lectures in the last weeks here in the Philippines. This one is the last one, and I think this one is definitely a highlight, because it's one thing talking to history of the Philippines to a general audience, and another thing talking to the history of the Philippines, in my case, southern Philippines, to experts and people who are really interested in the general history of the south of the Philippines, and the Bangsamoro group is very interested in the religious aspect of that history. So I'm very happy to be here today and to be presenting that topic to you. When you think of Zamboanga, most likely you're thinking of a million inhabitant city in the south of the Philippines. You're thinking of the city of the sardines, but there's also a cultural aspect to that. You have the cohabitation of the Tausug, of the Samal, of the Yaka there. There's culturally very intense situation there. In addition, when we go back in history, we have a place where we have very intense confrontations between Spaniards and Philippines going on. At the same time, a very intense cooperation between both groups. And one of the results of that history is, of course, the language. Chavacano is a very vivid sign of what's going on in Zamboanga, what has been going on in Zamboanga for the last 200, 300, 400 years. So I think it is worth looking at the common Philippine-Spanish history over time and see how this has become, and how we can see that the genesis was taking place between both groups and made Zamboanga what it is today. I would like to give you first a little context and then present to you several, I would say, aspects and episodes of what I found about Zamboanga in my research on some more specific topics. I hope that you will find it as interesting as I did. So, just to begin with a little bit of historiography, and I promise I'm very fast. I'll just give you one name per century. So I start with the 17th century, Francisco Combes, the 18th century, Juan de la Concepcion, missionaries, Franciscan Recollect, José Montero de Vidal, and Cesar Adib Machu, all people who have reflected, worked, and written on the history of Zamboanga. And all of them, or most of them, have been focusing on the so-called moral wars, a topic, a concept that's been very often described by a lot of historians, such as those. Diplomacy has sometimes also been a topic they have described. Mission was very strongly reflected, especially by the missionaries, and trade, which has not been so often reflected when it comes to the early modern period, like the 7th or 18th century. This is what I wanted to do here, and I'd like to start with the very first contact between Christian and Muslims in the Philippines. That was Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. And when in the first year in the Philippines, he was on Bohol, and there was a junk from the Sultanate of Brunei, Borneo. The first contact was, as you can imagine, not peaceful. There was heavy fighting going on, but this was apparently due to a misunderstanding. So the cargo was returned, and they started to talk. And they learned a lot because Borneo had much to tell them, because the Borneans, in general, was, in regard to commerce, were only intermediaries, while Manila was the real center of Indian and Chinese trade during the time. So they were very interested in getting access to the great market in Manila, as we will see. What about the Butuan trade? Because the Spaniards, at the same time as they were in Borneo, in the Visayas region, they were also sending a ship to Butuan, because there they heard there was a big trading center. And here it was cinnamon, wax, and gold that was interesting to them. And they got good rates, and the prices from the natives were positive, they were good. However, the Moros imposed their trade and cheated on them. That's the perspective of the Spaniards. Hence, due to their knacks and frauds, as Legazpi put it, the mistrust between both groups rose. And then the Spaniards developed a strategy to eliminate that Muslim competition. And the reason for that was threefold. It was commercial, religious, and political. On none of these levels, the Spaniards would accept any competition from the Muslims in that region if they wanted to create a colony in the Philippines. So, what was this military expansion starting from this first contact? In 1571, as you know, the conquest of Manila, with which they broke the Brunei dominance on the region, because Brunei was a dominant political entity in that time and was very strong in Manila and the Visayas. And from there, they established the Manila galleon economy and controlled the China-Manila trade. The next 20 years saw the attempts to expand further in the south, with Brunei, Sulu, and Mindanao in the focus. But the dominant interest during all the time was that they wanted to have access to the Molucca Islands to trade with spices. So from Magellan up to Legazpi, it was the spices that were in the center of interest for the Spaniards. And with this we come to the 17th century. So what about the preliminaries of the Spaniards in this Zamboanga Peninsula? It was Esteban Rodriguez de Figueroa, one of the first conquistadors of the Spaniards, who built the stone fort in La Caldera, which is not quite Zamboanga, but we're getting close there. So this fort was built in 96, but only lasted for 2 years. There were some reports that maybe in Caldera was already in 60s a fort as well, but have not confirmed that yet. However, in the next 10, 20 years, 30 years, there were still confrontations going on between the Muslims in the south and the Spaniards in the north. And hence the Spaniards returned to La Caldera in the 1610s and 1620s. There was especially one group that was pushing for a more resilient stronghold, and that was the Jesuit provincial Juan de Bueras. And there were several reasons why he wanted to return stronger to Zamboanga. He wanted to have a platform for offensives against immediate raiding fleets from the south, because most of them had to pass through this current that is between Basilan and Zamboanga. And the position of Zamboanga was a great place to establish a watchtower type of a place to warn the Visayan settlements from incoming raiders. And the third reason, I guess we can all guess what that was, for a Jesuit was, of course, evangelization. Zamboanga should become the central point for the evangelization of Mindanao. Well, following up on these recommendations, the Governor General Juan Ferreiro de Salamanca decreed to build that presidio, which was the name for the fortress, the presidio. So what they did was to establish a tax that each province of the Philippines had to sustain the maintenance of the Spaniards in Zamboanga, and Captain Juan de Chavez with 300 Spanish soldiers and 1,000 Visayan troops came to Zamboanga to start that project. However, the problems were great because there was no water in the place where they wanted to establish the fortress, and there was no quarry, so they had no chance to build the fortress. However, the Spaniards were not alone, and they could build on the experience of an architect. In this case, it was a Jesuit architect, Melchor de Vera. It has to be said that the Jesuits and the missionaries in general oftentimes had qualities that were very helpful. They could sing, they could paint, they could be useful in agriculture. In this case, Melchor de Vera had knowledge in regards to architecture and could really help the Spaniards build that fort in Zamboanga. And we can see here on the right side that the old Cariana church in Leyte, he was already very busy in the Philippines some years before to build a fort there. And then he was called to Zamboanga to help this Spanish enterprise there. So in June 23rd, 1635, the cornerstone of the Real Fuerza de San José, in San José, back then it was not yet Pilar, was built. And the question now is, what was the effect of that fort? The idea was that it should protect the Spaniards in the Visayas and Luzon, to protect the indigenous, the Filipinos there. However, in April 1636, a Maguindanao fleet arrived there and devastated the Calamianes. So apparently the direct effect was not very big. Here we have a very interesting map of the place of Zamboanga, and let's see if there, yes. So we have the fort here. This down here is the sea. That's the sea. Basilan would be down here somewhere, and here we have a moat. Here have the Manglanes, and here is the fortified settlement. So that's more or less how it looked like when it was erected. This brings me to the first function of Zamboanga, and we're getting to the topic of wars. I'm not focusing on all of the wars that were fought between Muslims and Christians in Zamboanga. That's far too much. I'm talking about the first war that was waged here. And that was the one from Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera, Governor General of the Philippines. He was listening to a lot of complaints about the ineffectiveness of Zamboanga, and hence he reacted. So he changed the leadership in San Bartolomé Díaz Barrera and the Sargento General Nicolas González. And he shifted his strategy. From mere defensive position, he went to the offense. So he prepared an armada to conquer Mindanao and sending an additional 300 Spanish and 100 Pampanga soldiers. They were stationed in Zamboanga for about 2 weeks, preparing for that attack, and attacked directly this person here. Yeah, I guess you all know them, because the person at that moment in Mindanao in charge was Sultan Kudarat. After the first attacks, the Sultan had to flee. He was wounded, and the Spanish troops installed themselves at the Great River area. Corcuera returned to Zamboanga, where he established his headquarters for negotiations, and indeed, Moncay, the ruler of Guayan, so upriver, sends his brother to sign a treaty. Spain accepts this Guayan ruler, Moncay, as the new ruler of the whole area, including the former lands of Kudarat. And on the other hand, Moncay delivers him captives, pays tribute, allows preaching of the Jesuits, let them establish a fort or several little forts, and enters into alliance with the Spaniards. That is the treaty that is sent, that is agreed on with Corcuera. And Corcuera can sell this very well as a huge victory, and he comes back to Manila with a triumphal march. What about Sulu? In January 4th, they also attacked Sulu, and just to be very brief, sent 600 soldiers and 50,000 indigenous troops, which means this time the forces were even stronger, even bigger, and again, the Spanish are victorious. I wouldn't say they were 100% victorious, but it can be sold as a victory from the Spaniards. So, Corcuera returns again. And the important part for Zamboanga is Admiral Pedro de Almonte is appointed governor of Zamboanga, and he is the commander-in-chief of all forces in the area, which means The governor of Zamboanga is the military commander of all southern stations, which gives Zamboanga a certain stand among the other presidios and the other fortresses. However, this situation of the supposed dominance of the Spaniards in the south it does not hold for long, because by 1644 most Spanish fortresses in Maguindanao and Sulu were already gone, especially due to lack of supplies and some unwise military decisions. Zamboanga, however, remains and becomes the platform for defense, the platform for mission, and the platform for diplomacy. And just a word to the word presidio, which means defense, and these presidios in the Spanish administrative system had two functions. First, they were military posts, the fortress, but in addition to that, the governor of the fortress had also the function as an administrator of the region around the fort, and he had the highest jurisdiction there. So it was a pretty powerful position to be the governor of one of these presidios. And this brings us to the case of diplomacy. So how was Zamboanga important in diplomacy? And after Corcuera's crusades, one could say, the situation became more peaceful, especially because the Spanish governors changed their strategy a little bit. In this case, the important thing for Diego Fajardo Chacon was to break the alliances between Maguindanao and the VOC. The VOC was the Dutch East India Company, and the Spaniards were at war with the Dutch for about 80 years. It's called the 80 Years' War. And we're here now at the last stages, and the war was fought with a lot of brutality in Europe, in America, and also in Asia. So the idea was that Chacon should try to avoid an alliance between the sultanates and the Dutch. So they changed the focus in defense, and there were two central figures here. The first one is Captain Francisco de Atienza, who had been Alcalde Mayor de Caraga, and in the 1640s he became governor of the Presidio of Zamboanga. The second important person here is Alejandro Lopez, a Jesuit who was director of the residence and mission of Mindanao and Sulu. These two people, this captain and this Jesuit, I would call them power couple. Because that power couple, Governor Atienza and Father Lopez, they were able to negotiate a lot in regard to diplomacy. Their first partner was Dipatuan Kudarat, so what Lopez did was travel a lot between Zamboanga and Simoy. Traveled there and forth to get finally a treaty on June 24, 1646, which included freedom for several enslaved people, peace and alliance, commerce should be included, preaching of the Jesuit was allowed, they could build a church there, and it defined the limits between the Spanish and the Maguindanao zone of influence. The treaty was signed from the Spanish side by the commander, the governor of the fort, Atienza, by the representative of the religious part of Lopez, and on the side of the Maguindanao from Pudarac, and the principal datus, which underlines the importance of the datus and shows that the Sultan was not the sole ruler, but had to agree with the datus that were in power. So what about Jolo? The situation was similar. The Dutch really wanted to also connect with the Zulus and have an alliance with them. So again, Lopez was the chief of the envoy, Atienza negotiated the name of the governor, and at this time Kudarat helped them. So he sent a special envoy to Jolo to help the Spaniards in their negotiation. The ruler of Sulu was Raja Bongso, and also in this situation, the most important datus were involved in the negotiation. It was not a one-man show by the ruler of Sulu. The treaty was signed on April 12, 1646, and the result of this treaty were that there were less violent years, and most importantly, neither the Maguindanao nor the Tausug made an alliance with the Dutch. At least officially, that was off the table. So, leaving diplomacy, we come to the topic of religion. How is religion important in this fortress Zamboanga? And we have a fantastic, a really nice missionary who was there and who wrote a lot about it. That's Francisco Convex, and up here we see his, I think it was 600-page book about Historia, I can read, de las Islas de Mindanao And this book is one of the basic information sources of the history of 17th century relation to Spaniards and Tausug and Maguindanao. He was an eyewitness, but at the same time he was a propagandist, because he saw the things and wrote them down, but he had a clear idea of what he wanted to show. He wanted to show the strength of the Spaniards in the south, but as well the importance of the Jesuits there. So he had a very clear mission what to do and what to write. However, it is very valuable to see what he writes, what he tells us now in the 21st century. He was there in 1650. That's just like 4 or 5 years after the Treaty of Peace. So it was peacetime observations. And there were several groups in Zamboanga. One group was the Lutaos, and there they saw there was a lot of progress. Lutaos would be the Samalbajau. Then there was a lot of progress, a little less, but still with the Subanos, the people of the rivers and the mountains. And there was much less with the Yakans. So in Basilan, they were having bigger problems with evangelizing, because the Islam apparently was stronger implemented in that region. He talked about the difficulties of the missionaries, because it's a long way of the visitas in the coastline. So we have Zamboanga down here, and they were working all the way up until Siocon. More or less, this region was the area of the Jesuits back then. And the missionaries wanted to promote the construction of stronger houses. They wanted to interest the natives in reducciones, which means bigger settlements, not so many small ones, but bigger ones, which would make the work for the missionaries easier. They argued against the desire for liberty, to have the small villages and to come down, and to change their magusahan, as Alonimo would say, to change their way of life. And for Combes, the Pampango soldiers who came with the Spaniards to Zamboanga, these were the role model to follow. So they showed these Pampango soldiers, that's how it's done. You have to convert to Catholicism, and these Pampangos have already done it, and a success model. So that was a little bit the strategy they were applying. So Combes saw a lot of local support, but also a lot of opposition. And the missionaries were also working with Pampanga escorts, because there was still a threat for them all the time. And the Jesuits hence had also the function as military commanders. And here the Spanish phrase, esta nación, sin duda, de las que para si bien necesitan de alguna violencia. So now he's talking about the nation in Siocon, and here he says that this nation here, for their own good, they need some violence, indicating the ideas of education and mission of the Jesuits then. Combes was against their natural laziness, and to change that, he was having the method of the carrot and of the stick. So he had presents and symbolic recognition for them on the one hand, on the other hand, violent punishment and symbolic exclusions. So there were several means that they applied. And in regard to distances, the ones closer to Zamboanga were easy to converge, and the ones farther away, they had more problems. The Jesuits wanted a drastic change in the lifestyle of the Filipinos there, to liberate some of their slaves, and that's a huge change in the lifestyle of people when you have servants or slaves and they're taken away from you. To build larger houses, more sturdy houses, and to have larger villages that should come down from the mountains to the coast. So a lot of changes were asked from them, from the Jesuits. And in his book, he also had not only describing the difficulties and problems, he also had some positive cases, how it worked, how it functioned. So many people converted and many people were baptized. However, this all came to none when at some point the Spaniards had to retreat from Zamboanga, and this was the legendary warlord Coxinga, or Sheng Chegong, who wanted to attack, threatened Manila, and the Spaniards retreated from the south, abandoned almost totally Mindanao, and hence they lost everything there. They lost their missions, lost their diplomatic efforts, their military success was none. So this was all going in the direction of nothing remained in Mindanao. This was already seen some years before, but with this retreat, everything was really lost. So no more part of Spanish colonial planning. Zamboanga was abandoned from the Spanish side. However, there were several promoters to return to Zamboanga. I think there were 3 or 4 orders from the Spanish king to return to Zamboanga, which were ignored in Manila because it was not feasible, it was not possible to return to Zamboanga. However, in the end, they did return. There was a debate if they should return to La Calera, but then that seemed to be too small. So in the end, in 1780, after 55 years, they returned and established, this time, the fort Nuestra Señora del Pilar de Zaragoza. And here, the picture from before again. This is what the Spaniards found when they came back. This was the abandoned Fort de San José. And upon them, on these walls that they found, they built the new fort. They found it in ruins, deteriorated and demolished, but still on top of it, they built the new fort. And what happens if in a rather peaceful period, a rather peaceful area, the Spaniards come back with a lot of soldiers? War starts again. So the confrontation starts again, and the attacks of the Tausug and of the Maguindanao and of other groups were very brutal at the beginning especially. So here we have a map of Zamboanga, and just very briefly we have the fort here, the fortified settlement down here. This one would be the native village of the Zamboanga, and this one, this seems to be the Parian. So there was also a Chinese place here. This one is a map from a little bit later. We have the fort here, the native villages here, that Parian would be here, and here we see some fields showing that of course it was necessary to feed the people. There's a lot of soldiers, as we will see, and they needed to be fed every day. And this one here, this last picture here, I would suppose this is what we see here on the right side, a watchtower. So this is also an end of the 18th century depiction of Zamboanga. We see the ships coming here, we see the watchtower here, the village here, and I think here at the end that should be either the governor's palace or the fortress of Zamboanga. Here we see it even better, the village here, maybe Parian here, and here's the fortified settlement, where here's the fortress, fortified settlement. And while the Spanish soldiers mostly were in the fort, the governor was out here, that was his palace. This was the Jesuit church and the Jesuit convent. This was the hospital and the barracks of the Pampanga soldiers. So that's basically how it was in the middle of the 18th century. And with it, we come finally, what did the Spaniards do in the 18th century here? I had a very nice report which tells us the annual cost of Zamboanga was over 12,000 pesos and about 3,500 fanegas of rice, a total of about 400 tons per year. So to maintain Zamboanga in the 18th century, a lot was necessary: rice, supplies, and money. And the basis was 3 Spanish infantry companies of 200 men and 1 company from Pampanga. And it wasn't only soldiers that were there. And I got another report from 1753. There were commanders and the Spanish and Pampanga infantry, but there was also a very large navy there. There were surgeons, clerks, gunsmiths, tillers, seamen, and even at least 2 chaplains were there. So a whole lot of people was there in Zamboanga on the Spanish payroll. In regards to the ships, what do we have here? There were at least 2 galleys, which means large galleon-type ships. They had the captain, the sergeant, a sargento, a tambor, piloto, so all in all about 44 crew members, plus 48 rowers. So we had a large number of about 100 people on one ship. And while in the 17th century, those rowers were basically slaves, in the 18th century they were mostly getting prisoners. So prisoners that had to have their sentence on these galleys. And then there were also galiotas, but these were used for transportation, because for provisioning the fort, they had to go a lot of times to Iloilo to get the rice from there, because Iloilo was kind of the basket case for Zamboanga. Let's take a look at the arsenal in the middle of the 18th century. There were 63 larger cannons, so that's a lot. Many more smaller cannons, about 33 pedreros, cannonballs, powder, ammunition, almost 300 rifles, which means new guns, and 92 arquebuses and 52 muskets, which are kind of older type guns. But still, there was a lot of firepower in Zamboanga, which means that Zamboanga was a highly fortified military forward post. So, really a strong Spanish post there. And I would like to talk about two more incidents here. The first incident you've probably all heard about is the incident of Aziz-ud-Din. He was a Sultan of Sulu and was expelled from his realms. One of the reasons was probably he was too pro-Spanish and not defending his people enough in their eyes, probably. So the decision, he was expelled from Jolo and fled to Zamboanga, to his allies, to the Spaniards, and they had to decide what has to be done with him. So they sent him to Manila, where he arrived on January 3rd, and after a year of being there, he was baptized in Paniqui on April 28, 1750. I suppose you've all heard from that. I think there's a very interesting transcultural, transreligious story that's happening here, and I've written about that in some paper of mine. But what is the idea now? The Spaniards have in Manila a baptized sultan. What do we do with this new King Fernando? We bring him back and install him as a king in Sulu. So the idea was to bring him back with military forces. They depart in Manila in March 28, 1751, arrive in Zamboanga on July 12th, and there are 3 happy weeks because the Sultan stays in Zamboanga and celebrates like a second court in Zamboanga. He receives family and friends for 3 weeks, but then the Spaniards grow suspicious and arrest him. They suspect an attack and arrest 202 people, including several women, in Zamboanga. These 17 ships that are there at the moment have 14 cannons, 6 guns, and 65 lances. If you compare that with what I just mentioned for Zamboanga, the threat seems minor. However, he was suspicious and he remained in prison. And you see the change, the sudden change. Out of 200 honorable guests, within some hours they become 200 prisoners. So I think that shows the function of Zamboanga, which could be a court and then become a prison very fast. Finally, they were sent back to Manila and arrived in Cavite. And I'm not going to follow the story here anymore, just showing that the function of Zamboanga was relevant here. This brings me to the second incident already. The second incident takes place about 20 years later. It is after the British occupation of Manila in the 60s. The British occupation of Manila is a landmark event in the history of the Philippines. And Spain remains definitely alert in regard to the British. And Zamboanga serves as an observation post. And the fortress commander at that moment, the governor, is Raimundo Español. In the 70s, there start rumors that the British plan a settlement somewhere around the Sulu area. And so the Spanish sent a reconnaissance mission, they sent Lieutenant Colonel Juan Chencheli. And I would ask you to please remember those 2 names. We have the governor, Raimundo Español, and we have the Colonel Juan Chencheli. So these 2 people are going to be the protagonists of the next 2 or 3 minutes. So, Chencheli arrives, or he comes from Manila to Zamboanga with a galley and 2 galiotas. We've already seen there are several hundred men aboard, so in this case 150 troops. And the official goal is to hunt for Ilano raiders. That's the official mission that he has. But there's a secret goal, and that is reconnaissance and confront the British and basically tell them to go away. He arrives in Zamboanga very late, he's delayed, and only arrives there in November, December of 1773. So right away he has to leave, and his mission is very clear. He should leave Zamboanga, find the English, find the British somewhere in this island, and he knows by then already they will be somewhere in Balamagan. That's a small island off the coast of Borneo. So he should go there, show how surprised he is, and then tell them that's officially Spanish regions, which they shouldn't be there. So, Governor Español from Zamboanga wanted to send 6 days later his messenger to the Sultan of Sulu to tell him, to inform him about the real mission objective, so that his ally, and Sulu are the allies of the Spaniards in that moment, are informed about the real plans of the Spaniards. That is the plan. The idea is that Mr. Cole, the British factor in Jolo, would not be able to inform the British beforehand. So it should be a secret so that Cenchelli could carry out his mission. Good. What happens really? Cenchelli never goes to Balamanga, never searches for the British. He goes to Jolo directly, officially because there was not enough water and not enough provisions there. What really happened is very difficult to understand. However, he is in Jolo now, and he's received very friendly at first, but the visit is not announced, and he behaves very unorthodoxly. Cenchelli doesn't know the situation and the cultural context. He behaves, in the eyes of the Tausug, very strangely. It's an irregular conduct that we have here. So what the Tausug do is be skeptical and prepare the defenses. They prepare for a possible Spanish attack. Remembering the times 20 years ago when there was all-out war, Spaniards against the Tausug. So they prepare the defenses, including with the help of the Chinese that are there, with the designs that are there, and including the few British who are there, are also preparing to help the Tausug against the Spaniards. So on a diplomatic level, a very complex situation there. And it is a total disaster. I don't go into details, but what really happens is that Cenchelli comes back to Zamboanga after, I think, 3 weeks in Jolo. And there, he does not hand over the journal of the travel to Espanyol. So Espanyol never knows what's going on there because the journal is never given to him. And between those two officers, between Cenchelli and Espanyol, even though there should be buena armonía, there should be in harmony, one officer with the other officer, according to the instruction of the Governor General, they are quarreling. They are having a huge dispute in Zamboanga, and even though they are both in this fortified settlement here, for weeks and months they don't talk to each other, but write letters, one to the other. And that's horrible on a personal level. For me as a historian, it's wonderful. Because now we have the information, now we know what they were talking about, how they felt, and so I can explain what the problems were. One problem was to explain the failure. How would they explain the failure of the whole mission? And they quarreled about how to explain that. Not going into details here. Another aspect was meat for the troops. Each officer wanted to have a bigger chunk of meat on the plate for their officers. A minor issue, but they were writing letters there and for about this issue. Give and accept advice. In the instructions from the Governor General, there was very clear that Cenchelli should give advice to Espanyol. And when he arrived directly in Zamboanga, Cenchelli comes to Espanyol and wants to give advice on some cases. What to do with the Tausug. However, Espanyol is very rude and tells him basically, I don't need your advice. And he does that in the presence of all officers. So Cenchelli is humiliated in front of all of the officers. And this is a very unfortunate thing because the emotions go pretty high between those officers. And the next point is the messenger to Sulu. After the disaster in Jolo, both officers wanted to explain what happened and sent an envoy to Jolo. And in the end, they don't agree who that would be, and so they sent two different envoys there. Again, on a diplomatic level, a huge disaster. The basis for the conflict, in my view, is really who has the highest authority. There are just two cocks fighting over authority. And that has to do with ranks, position, and nobility, in my view. Ranks. Cenchelli is a colonel. He was just when he was there promoted from lieutenant colonel to colonel, so now he was a colonel. Espanyol is only captain, so it's 2 or 3 ranks below. However, now we come to position, and in that position, Cenchelli is the commander of a special mission. But Espanyol is the governor of the whole Presidium. So here it is Espanyol who would be higher. And in regard to nobility, Cenchelli comes from a noble Italian family, while Espanyol is rather of no or very low nobility. So we have several layers, and in each layer, one or the other feels himself superior to the other. And so we have this huge fight in the middle of Zamboanga. So, there's one final accusation of Cenchelli against Espanyol, and that is that the governor of Zamboanga trades with Sulu and Maguindanao. So there's commerce in between, and that's forbidden for officers. They're not allowed to trade with the enemy or anybody. He has a salary. That should be enough. So the accusation of Cenchelli is that the commercial interests makes him blind for the real needs of the colony. So what we have here is a collision between personalities and ideas. On the one hand, we have the personal level, and there's a lot of contempt from one to the other. but we also have confrontation between the established practices of the government español, and on the other hand, of the enlightened ideas. Because remember, we are in a time when in Europe the enlightened ideas start to be going around, and the Berg reforms should be implemented in America and in Asia. So this is confrontation of mentalities and theories. So, enlightened ideas on the military level in the Philippines, that would mean that the interest of the crown should be first always. That the chain of command is always very clear, and that the conduct of a gentleman, of a military gentleman, is not okay with trading with the enemy, trading with anybody. That would be an officer's behavior. And on that level, they're not able to find an agreement. What are the consequences? Thanks to the mission from Español, the tensions with the Sulu calm. By the way, here you see the map. We have Zamboanga here, we have Sulu here, and all the way here is Balambangan. That's Borneo. So instead of going directly there, he goes to Sulu and stays there for 3 weeks. So that's just geographical orientation. What about the British? They established themselves to Balambangan. That's true. However, due to several reasons, the British are expelled in 1775 from the Tausug from Balambangan, which is interesting for the Tausug because they received a huge booty. It's worth almost 1 million pesos. It's a huge amount of money, and with that money, the Sulu in the region are able to consolidate their position. And that's the negative part for the Spaniards, increase their incursions in the Philippines. So on the one hand, the positive outcome is that the British are gone, which were the biggest concern of the Spaniards. On the other hand, the military capacities of the Tausug and the allies, the Irano, is going up. What are the consequences for the two officers? Español is called back to Manila. There were so many complaints that they have to be calling him back. He's replaced by Juan Bayot. However, Chencheli continues quarreling also with his successor. Chencheli finally also returns as colonel of the infantry regiment to Manila, where he stays for some more time. I have not heard anything about his promotion or demotion. I don't know anything what happens after that. Raimundo Español, his career advances, he rises up, and after some years he asked for Manila to be brought back as governor of Zamboanga again. So apparently he likes that place so much, or maybe the commercial possibilities were so interesting in Zamboanga. So let's take a look at the trade in Zamboanga and start with the presidio trade in the 17th century very briefly. We had these peace agreements, first in Maguindanao. And this peace agreement between Zamboanga and Maguindanao included subjects of the Spanish king were allowed to trade freely in Mindanao, but subjects of the Sultan could trade in Zamboanga and other Spanish lands, and only a fee of 5% was elevated. So there was trade going on. In the 7th century, in the time the Spaniards were in Zamboanga, there was trade between Zamboanga and the Maguindanao. What about the Tausug? In the peace agreement with the Sultan Raja Bongso, trade is not mentioned. However, we have to mention as a sign of brotherhood, the Sultan sent 3 small huangas full of rice to Zamboanga each year for sustenance of the fortress. And I would be very mistaken if that would not mean that there was also trade going on between Jolo and Zamboanga. So these are short periods, only like 30 or 20 years period. However, let's look to the 18th century. A very prominent figure here of Southeast Asia. This one is Alexander Dalrymple, a British scholar and geographer of the East India Company. And he is the author of the Oriental Repertory of 1793. But he has some sources that go back as far as 1740. In this case, it's a person from Ojolo, Orangiogo, who writes in the time of Azimuddin, which means in the time when there was peaceful relation between Spaniards and Tausug. He writes that the Spanish had a fort in Jolo and about 100 Spanish soldiers there in the Sultan's service. There was no church, but the Spaniards were trading frequently with Jolo. So this is another indication, a clear indication that trade was going on between Muslim and Christian in that area. Now let's come to a very different kind of source. This one is the Anantha Buscón Don Pablos por Filipinas. There's an initial book of the 17th century, that's by Francisco de Quevedo, La Vida del Buscón. It's a very famous book in Spain. And there is a sequel to that novel, and this sequel to the novel is called Andantes Buscando Fabros por México y Filipinas. So while the original version is only telling the stories about this rascal somewhere in Spain, his new story is continuing his adventures in Mexico and in the Philippines. And the author is, very interestingly, a Jesuit with over 10 years experience in Zamboanga. So while this is a novel, I would say the basis he's having on what's going on in Zamboanga are very solid. What does he tell us, this Vicente Alemany? Well, Don Pablos, the person, the protagonist or the anti-hero, is in Zamboanga and practices corruption. What's going on there? By chance, he becomes the governor of Zamboanga, is withholding the salary from the soldiers for his own businesses, sends merchandise to Sulu and Maguindanao, encourages trade as was habitual in past times, and implements forbidden commerce. And in addition, as an officer of the crown, he's having his own gambling house where the Moros, the Chinese, and the natives gamble. So, a lot of things that are not accord with what an officer should do. Let's take another look at what's going on in the middle of the 18th century. Now, going away from the novel and back to the facts. We are having the Maestro de Campo, Antonio Ramón de Abad. He was on a special mission sent to Zamboanga. And if you take a look here at the years, this is the years when, or this is the mission actually, that should bring Asimuddin back and implement him as king of Sulu. And we know it ended in a disaster. So what did this Maestro de Campo do there? Well, he was trading with Sulu. He was actually buying sea slugs from Sulu and selling Philippine blankets and other merchandise to them. In addition, one more point. The interesting thing is he was just coming there. He didn't have a lot of experience, but still he was trade very fast. So how was he able to come there and start to trade right away? And that was with the help of Chinese intermediaries. As we have seen on the map, there was a Parian in Zamboanga. And as I mentioned as well, in Jolot there were Chinese as well. And between those two Chinese groups, their establishing trade was not so complicated. So Ramón de Abad was entering negotiation with the Chinese. So, what else did he do? He sent his subordinates to buy rice from Maguindanao on his account. So he sent soldiers on military boats from Zamboanga to Mindanao to trade for him on his account. And then when he came back, he sold the price for double the price. So he made some handsome profit from that negotiations. In addition, in Mindanao he bought beeswax and cacao, which he sent directly to Manila. In the law case that we saw afterwards in regard to his misconduct, he said that this wax of cacao was for his private purpose, for his private use. However, we're talking here of about 2 or 3 tons of wax, and we're talking about 500 or 600 kilograms of cacao. That's a lot of private use here. And he was selling iron, blankets, and ampules to the Sultan. So in his residencia, he was acquitted of all that he did, and that's due to the indulto. The indulto is a legal instrument. It is a royal pardon for wrongdoing of officials. And this explains a little bit the conduct of the commanders and alcaldes mayores during the time. Because while it is true, an officer and a governor and alcalde mayor are not allowed to trade, they're not allowed to go and sell and buy things because they had a salary. They still, most of them did it. So what became habitual then in the 18th century in the Philippines and in America was that at the beginning of the term, they paid a tax. And that tax included an indulto, a pardon. Which means that beforehand, they were already pardoned for possible wrongdoings. So when they then were caught trading and behaving incorrectly, they already had their pardon and would not have to worry about that. Just to explain how that worked and why he was acquitted. Of course, on a moral level, Concepcion, our chronicler from the 18th century, totally blames him and makes him responsible for a lot of bad things that happened. Let's go ahead in time 50 years. Let me look at the beginning of the 19th century even, an Augustinian, Joaquín Martínez de Zúñiga, in his work Estadísimo de las Islas Filipinas. He traveled to the Philippines for 2-3 years, and he found that he had to blame the exmoliolus and the government of Zamboanga for embezzlement and misappropriation of funds for their personal gain. So he continued apparently in that line. The governors had a quasi-monopoly, despite the prohibitions. They intimidated their competitors and they dictated the prices. And the use of Navy lintas, the small ships, were sent to barter instead of control waters. He even put numbers to the profits. He said that the higher officials could gain 20 to 50,000 pesos in about 4 years, which is a lot of money. They were trading abaca, wax, cacao, textiles, and gold, and even cannons and other weapons. So the indulto covered a lot, but in general, misappropriation of funds, embezzlement, selling cannon to potential enemies would not have been covered by this indulto. But I would say we're really moving in a very big gray area between legality and not legality. That brings me to my conclusions. Zamboanga between 1635 and 1800s. It was a military bulwark. It was a forward post to the basis for military offensives, and it was a permanent lookout for enemy movements. In addition, it was the missionary basis and the missionary platform for evangelization. And it was a center for intercultural and interreligious diplomacy. In addition, it was a trading post with Sulu and Maguindanao and the officers of Spain all being involved together with the Chinese. And one of the central elements here was the indulto, which was giving them the chance to go about that commerce. And finally, if you take a look at the whole of the Spanish Empire, and take a look at the Philippines as such, and look where Zamboanga is, we really find Zamboanga in this Spanish Empire as a frontier, the border region, and Zamboanga is and always was, during the Spanish times, a frontier marker, and as such, very important for the Spanish in the Philippines. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirshan, and for that very rich discussion and lecture. So at this point, to share their perspectives and their insights regarding the lecture, we have invited some reactors. So let me introduce our first reactor. Is an professor here at the UP Asian Center, Dr. Maria Cecilia Medina. And our second reactor is founding officer of the UP Bangsamoro Studies Group, Shariful Hashim Mansul. So let us first start with the first reactor, Dr. Medina.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kirshan, for your talk. Quite extensive, and has dealt a lot also on the military bulwark that is in Zamboanga, including trade and the missionaries, the missions. I think what this shows us is really the importance of history. Our college has an interdisciplinary focus on Philippine studies and Asian studies. But history is very important, even if we want to know really the present. My research in Zamboanga has been more on the present, of course, but I have some informants from Simariki, from the Sama group, which is in the coastal part of Zamboanga. Especially when we had the Zamboanga siege, which was a very unfortunate incident, tragedy and disaster, actually man-made disaster, after two natural disasters in that year, 2013, after Typhoon Haiyan, the Visayas, and then you had the Bohol earthquake. There was the Zamboanga siege, if you remember. And I did some research try to see the situation and also the responses. Beautiful thing at present is really they have interfaith, interreligious groups, no? Led by civil society, different churches, Catholic, Christian, other Christian groups, and including the Subanen and the Samabangini and in Zamboanga. In fact, Zamboanga city was the first to have the so-called Week of Peace celebrations every year, and then it became Mindanao-wide. No? So there's a because of its very the different ethnic groups in the city and the difficulties also of conflict, especially in Basilan, in Sulu, especially even in the 70s when we had the MNLF and all that, wars and all, more present, no? But Zamboanga has been more of a refuge for evacuees, etc. So when the siege happened, it became a battleground, actually. It became a place of conflict. And one affected community were the Sama-Bangingi. And I had an informant, the tribal chieftain of the Sama-Bangingi. Their community was supported, was able to build their mosque and their houses again, which were burned down during the siege, and boats also, through the help of civil society groups. I'm saying this because yesterday I had a chance to communicate with this tribal chieftain, because I remember in one of my interviews to him, he said that our ancestors helped build the fort, no? So it was always in my mind, how would that be? So I had a chance to talk to him, and he said that, of course, it was a kind of forced labor. They had no choice. They were stronger. And they were also asked to be the divers for corals, because the fort has a lot of corals. No? So I said, wow. And then he also mentioned they have this warrior, they called Panglima Tauhan, who, because I said, I think your community also supported the sultanate. You were the warriors. He said, yes. So they supported, they have a community in called Bangingi Municipality. So this Panglima Tampan was the leader of that. And unfortunately, he said, when they were very strong, protecting the sultanate, but one time they went to Borneo, as they always move, and that was the time they were able to get the Spaniards were able to make their moves. No? So I said, he can talk about that, and also his grandfather, etc. And this Sama Bangini, who was also at one time got the support of the Spaniards inside the fort. He was supposed to be one of the guards, but then later he wasn't as doing his work as well, so he left. No, so there is a relations. I wonder really more and more about how it was at that time. Of course, this is colonial time, and at present you have also in the fort itself a Marian outdoor shrine, which Muslims and Christians both put flowers, candles, and go to. No? And I also wonder how far back there was that kind of relations. Although I also see that the Maguindanao Sultanate and the Sulu Sultanate, this made me really also interested, had also been, yeah, collaborating in trying to attack also the fort, the Spaniards. But they were few in number, the Spaniards. But of course, they had the fort, they had the guns and the cannons, etc. So they did not make it. No? About 3,000 Moros of King the Lassie, for example, in 1720, attacked. No? And I tried to find out, this is Maguindanao. As I said, really, they have been, this is the maritime Philippines, no? Maritime, at least this community of Zamboanga have been going around. They have been trading way back, even before the Spaniards came and tried to fortify themselves. And they were also, I think the Spaniards also strengthened or wanted to keep that fort against the slave raids in the Visayas or even up to Luzon. So it was like a checkpoint, a way of controlling their movements. And of course, the people, the Moros, that they did not like that. They resisted. Also became a penitentiary at one point. The fort. So I think looking at the history, going back, and all even including what you said about, I think that's very interesting, looking even into the relations among the Spaniards themselves and the quarrels that they had could affect how they would relate, plus also how they would be give so much importance also to repelling or keeping at bay the VOC, the other foreign, not only the British, but also the Portuguese and the Dutch. So I think there's much to do in the Philippines, as well as perhaps, yeah, going back through all this, the archives of different even congregations, the Jesuit, the Augustinian, more in the northern Mindanao, the Jesuits more in this western part, to see. But we can only, many times it's about, yeah, the military, but their interests are very clearly going out in your discussion also, which is something I really appreciate. Their desire for spices, their desire for expanding their trade, and of course, keeping their hold in the Philippines. And another interesting thing, I think, is to see also that Filipinos in other parts of the country, from the Pampangos in Luzon to even, I think, you can include the Visayas, the Boholanos, the Cebuanos, many were also brought to Zamboanga to help in the building of the fort. And you also have South Americans, Mexican, Peruanos, also supporting the fort. So all this, I think, has to be explored more with looking into, so Philippine studies and Mindanao studies should be able to look at all these connections. And even when we look at the period of colonialism, I think we have to also be, it's not a simple thing of saying the sword and the cross. There are many, many other things to say, nuances, etc., that play in this very in these different periods. So I'd like to thank you for your presentation. There's really much to still study for us or research, no? As I said, and it goes beyond just Mindanao or Zamboanga, but yeah, the rest of Asia and the bigger part of other continents. So thank you very much. Besides that also, I think for the present, if you try to see, this has implications also for what we're trying to do, civil society, scholars, to promote culture of peace, intercultural understanding, interreligious understanding. It's a shared history after all, and yeah, we can, that's the beauty of field work. If you go to the field, you talk to locals and you get this leads maybe, insights, and then you go to the archives and also do archival work. You can find more and more, and you should know Spanish to read the Spanish sources. So that's a challenge, I think, for us also. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Medina. And now, Sir Mansour.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to say that I'm not a historian, and pondering upon this responsibility, I thought I could also not pretend to be one. So I want to make clear my positionality. Much of my reaction will come from my experience of Zamboanga as someone who studied under the Jesuits, stationed in the city, and the Sulu archipelago as someone who was born there, and as a Moro myself, accurately speaking, a Tausug. And from the vista of the present in relation to the discussion. First, I would like to thank Dr. Eberhard for this very comprehensive discussion. I learned a lot about the city. It kind of made me feel different things about Zamboanga. Personally, I don't really like Zamboanga, but this made me rethink that affect towards it. So I will begin with a wonderful idea by Filipino historian Patricio Abinales in one of his articles published in Minda News. Zamboanga, to him, represents both the end and the start of two civilizations. The larger Nusantaran or maritime Southeast Asian realms, consisting today of Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, Singapore, and their more global connections to China and India. And of course, the global cultural sphere of the Spanish Empire, extending from the Philippines to America. And here, I want to extend the spirit of presenting Zamboanga as a complex, if not a cosmopolitan hub, that cannot easily be reduced to dualistic antagonism between the colonized and the colonizer. I really agree with that. I want to praise the presentation's different highlighting of Zamboanga, from military antagonism towards trade, albeit clandestinely. The Zamboanga siege, for example, really made Zamboangueños feel this antagonism since 2013. And I think discussions like this change that a little bit. It also substantiates with history, in centuries of history, our present attempts to promote coexistence. We've been doing this in Zamboanga for a long time. There are a lot of peace advocates in the city promoting religious and ethnic coexistence. What this discussion does is it substantiates it with real-life examples in the last centuries. And this is true today. Zamboanga is simultaneously Catholic and Islamic, with the mighty fourth pillar attracting not only Christian devotees, as you might already know. There are occasional Muslim locals who genuinely believe in the miracles of Fort Pilar, who would visit the fort. In food too, this manifests in a variety of both Malay and Malay-like indigenous dishes, that one can encounter therein. Street food like mie goreng, popular Indonesian noodle dish, also is present in Zamboanga as a street food. Magi curry, it's popular instant noodle dish, popular in Sabah, but it's also widely consumed more than Lucky Me in Zamboanga. So you also have stuff like satay, you have like stuff like terangbulan, asaba Malaysian pancake, also sold as a street food in Zamboanga, but it's more popular in Malaysia. So alongside that, you see Spanish-influenced dishes like estofado and paella, served alongside the same tables. So it's an interesting, in the culinary dimension at least, one can find with clarity a non-antagonistic convergence of cultures through shared menus. So also, I've been in one of the barter areas where a lot of Southeast Asian goods are sold, from Malaysian chocolates, Indonesian cigarettes, probably smuggled, but tolerated, Pakistani pashminas, and Thai sarongs. You would see a lot of sarongs with elephants, and you would know that that is Thai. So, and also what I found really interesting in the discussion is the excerpt from Alemany's novel, and Don Pablo's character. It was a very interesting characterization of a Zamboanga official, because in Zamboanga there is a strong sense that this is not holo. This is different from holo. We don't have smuggled items here. This is Catholic. This is more upright and more legal. But when you go to the marketplaces, you would still see smuggled cigarettes. You would still see the same smuggled Malaysian chocolates. So where does all this come from? And in the novel of Alemany, you could say maybe there's also a Don Pablo in the present. So, and this is not a secret, it's an open secret that the ruling families of Zamboanga openly trade with holo, openly smuggle goods from Malaysia and Indonesia, but under the language of legality. Or maybe no. Yeah, so in holo, I would like to say also something about holo, where I originally come from. I would like to say several things. So in holo, the generic term for money is pilak. And in one of Dr. Eberhard's work, I learned that the influx of silver in Southeast Asia is largely owed to the arrival of the Spaniards, the silver bullion, if I can remember correctly. So I can say that, yes, the Spanish Empire influenced Sulu a lot, even if historiographically, if you consult Mahul or Najib Salibi, great historians of Sulu, they would always make the distinction between Sulu as part of maritime Southeast Asia and the Philippines as part of the Spanish Empire. But in truth, these two converge in many ways than we understand, especially if we study food and language. And also terms like, if I can remember correctly, we have a word for blanket called manta. And I learned, searching for its etymology, it comes from a Latin American term, not exactly Spanish. But there I learned that the Manila-Acapulco trade also really affected culturally the Tausugs, that it penetrated the Tausug language more than just, encounters such as what we have seen. And also, there are also intermarriages. In Sulu, you can find a very prominent political family, the Izquierdos. And there's a governor of Sulu in the 60s. I can't remember. But Murphy Izquierdo. And he traces his lineage to Basque origin in Spain. This is published by the New York Times, because when the war in Holo in 1974 began, the New York Times wrote that their governor was of Basque origin, but is Muslim at the same time. So that's very interesting. And also the Alvarez, who later joined the Moro National Liberation Front. So imagine a Muslim with Alvarez as a last name, but fighting against the government and fighting for Islam. So that's something that we don't often see. And of course, the Chinese. In Holo, you can see a Chinese cemetery. In Holo, you have a barangay called Barangay Chinese Pier. It was once called Parian Lanna. We have discussed Parian here, I believe. And also, the first Sultan of Sulu, Syed Abu Bakr, if you visit his graveyard in Mount Tumangtangis, you will see Chinese tombstones alongside his tomb. So, yeah. And many other examples of convergences. So, I think to end, I would like to comment on two parts of the presentation. Or maybe just one, because I've already commented on the Alimane novel. I want to comment on the Kenchelli mission because it's so interesting. Because it made me think, were the British not removed from Balambangan Island, would they have stronger stronghold in Sulu, affecting sovereignty claims, the Spanish sovereignty claims, in the sale of the Philippines to the Americans in 1898? And I could be a Malaysian citizen now if they weren't driven out of Balambangan. Because if they weren't driven out, then Sulu would have become British territory, right? And could not be sold to the Americans. So you see these unexpected consequences of history. If Kenchelli just failed a little more than his already apparent failure. And one can also see in the incident the complexity of the Sultanate of Sulu, because it collaborated with the British in the Visayas. But if you read Sulu scholars now, they would often always antagonize the Visayas. But it's not so true, because a lot of them have actually Visayan roots. So I would like to end there, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Barry. And at this point, maybe our speaker can react to the reactions. Maybe you have a response. Thank you.
No. So give him some time. Okay, that works. Maria Mahmoud, thank you very much for your fantastic comments, reactions. I think they were very thoughtful and reflected a lot of things I said. I have taken some notes. I think some of them overlapped as well. Maybe starting with you already, because I think this food dimension you mentioned is a really wonderful food of anthropological level, talking about the food and how it reflects the convergence of ethnicities, convergence of different peoples is really wonderful. So I am no anthropologist, so I can't comment on that, but I really found the picture very nice that you gave us there. In regard to your last comment, what would have happened is, what if is for historians always forbidden, you know. You can't do that. It would be too many what ifs. I'd like to follow through, but it's impossible for me to do that. My impression would be that if the British would have stayed there, yeah, maybe they would have expanded a little bit their influence over Sulu, but maybe not. Maybe not. Actually, they didn't want to stay in Balambangan at all, because they thought it was a barren, sad rock with nothing on it. And Dalrymple, and also the commander of this expedition, Mr. Herbert, he wanted to go back to Sulu because he thought Sulu is a nice place. Give us Tawi-Tawi or something else, but don't send us to Balambangan. However, there was no chance to that, and the Sultan Azimuddin and the son Israel were much more inclined to the Spaniards than to the British. So this, in that regard. Good. You mentioned the dualism, and Maria, you as well. You mentioned that. That it is very easy for historiography to focus on two different ways: the one against the other, black against white, Moros against Christians. But it is of course much more complicated than that. And you mentioned at the beginning these two perspectives of Avinales, and the Sulu as part of Southeast Asian world, and Sulu as part of the global Spanish world. But it is much more complicated than that as well. Coming from, and that's my background more or less, even though I'm Austrian, I'm coming from the Spanish perspective, which means that oftentimes in Spain we look at the whole situation like, okay, this is Spanish, and we have the confrontation with the Moors in the south, point, full stop, that's it. Day before yesterday I was having a talk at the NHCP, and in the debate we were talking about frontier regions, and it was mentioned that Zamboanga is a frontier region. And I said, yes, is it? But why and for what and how? Because it always depends on how you look at it. When you perceive the Spanish Empire, then Zamboanga was the last frontier region. Totally, absolutely, yes. However, if you take it from the, I don't know, maybe Lutao standpoint, it was just one point just as many others. Or from the Maguindanao perspective, or from the Tausug perspective. They were in negotiations with the Moluccas Islands. They were in contact with Borneo. They were in contact with the Salvadingi that were going all around. When you look at the maps, wherever they were traveling, they go as far as to Vietnam in the north, in the west to Malaysia, everywhere. They've been everywhere. So how is Zamboanga a frontier region? It's connected. It's connected so many other places. It is difficult to say if it's really a frontier region. From a Spanish perspective, yes. From a local perspective, I would say it wasn't a frontier. It was one place among many others that was connected to the whole world. The same as when we look at the Manila Galleon, for example, we often look at the Manila Galleon as a link between Manila and Acapulco. But it was much more complex than that. It was the connection between from Acapulco going down to all the way to Peru, to Europe. It was a connection to China. It was a connection to Japan. We're going to Borneo. We're going to India. So this is a very complex network, and not really just a two-way connections. Okay, what else? You were mentioning Spaniards and Latin America. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of Latin Americans, and when we're talking in historiography about the Spaniards on the one side and the Pampangos on the other side, or the other indigenous groups, it is of course barely any Spaniards. We're mostly talking about Latin Americans. We're mostly talking about the people from Mexico that have been gathered together as soldiers or as sailors to be working there in that region. And hence the cultural aspect is enormous. Like the Nahuatl words that we have in Tagalog, and I think as well in Zamboanga or in Chabacano. There's a lot of Mexican influence there. I'm sure in food you find as well a lot of influence from Mexico here. In regard to religion, you both mentioned the shrine. I was very impressed by this Pilar shrine that is at the side of the Fort Pilar, and how it is the shrine for Muslims and the shrine for Christian Catholics as well. And both go there today and say, as you say, they believe in the wonders brought about by Maria. So I think this is also a very interesting cultural combination that we're having there. And I would love to learn more about what's going on now there, because back in the 18th century, I think this was not happening there. On a religious level, it was the Jesuits in that regard, and later on the Recollects that were implementing the Catholic belief very strongly there. So I think on that level, there was not so much a cohabitation as we're having that really now. Just what you said about, okay, which type? That Zamboanga were on one side fighting the Spaniards, on the other side helping them. The question is, how did they help? How free was this for them? It is, again, going back to the question a little bit of what was the lifestyle of the Zamboanga? What did the Lutao do? And when I read the works of Argonimo, for example, to understand what is going on with the Zamboanga, Samadilaut, and I can't really understand how the missionaries really worked there, because when the people are moving all the time, I know they're not moving all the time, they stay in this mooring for one time and then to the other one, but they leave and all of a sudden they're away. And Combes now tells me he was very happy with the missioning work of the Zamboanga. Then I wonder, really? What was going on there? With the Subana, I would understand it better because they're more stable people, but yeah. So a lot of questions still to be investigated. And again, the works of Argonimo, for example, helped me to understand a little bit how it was, because that's anthropology. That's not history. And for me, it is always very important to be here myself, to see the places. I was traveling a lot from Ilocos, Mindoro, to look for watchtowers, to see where these watchtowers, how have they been built, what is the importance of them, have they been visible, have they been invisible, what is the topological, anthropologic about these watchtowers, how can they be read, how can they be seen. And sometimes you really have to read anthropologists to understand some parts of that. Another point is that the slaves that you were mentioning, I think as well, it was not only the Maguindanao, the Ilanon, or the Dasuk that were looking for slaves. The Spaniards were looking for slaves. The Spaniards were using slaves as their galley slaves. They were selling them off to Mexico. They were using them in Manila. So at the 7th century, when we talk about slave raids, it was not only the Ilanon or the Cabuzones that were raiding slaves. It was also the Spaniards. And when I was showing this case of Corcuera after the 1630s, one of the things that he got out of these campaigns was a lot of slaves. He brought them to Manila. When I'm talking about this triumphal marches entering into Manila, he was bringing captives of war to Manila and then selling them as slaves. So it's not only slave raids from part of the Muslim raiders, it was Spaniards as well doing the same thing. And you were also mentioning the quarrels that were going on, the Chencheli and the Espanyol. And I think that's very interesting because we rarely see information on that, on the quarrels between Spaniards. We have information about the quarrels, about even civil wars between the rulers of Maguindanao going on there, with brothers, with cousins, as well. It is the same thing with Jolo, when sometimes Jesuits were involved as well. We have quarrels in all sides. Also the Spaniards quarreled. They oftentimes did not speak with one voice, but sometimes also with two voices. And just one final point I want to reply to the many things that you have said is, you said learn Spanish. 2 days ago I was at the National Historical Commission. After my talk and after the discussion, the moderator stood up and said, one last question, what would you recommend for young scholars to do? What should they do? I just said, just 2 words, learn Spanish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kriashan. And at this point, I open the floor for your questions. So please just raise your hand and our staff will bring the mic to you. So maybe... Sorry about that. Okay. So maybe you can approach me instead. Okay, so first question. Maybe we can gather questions to save time.
Hello. Okay. This is more of a reflection than a question for Dr. Kriashan. Your presentation reveals how Zamboanga stood as a colonial bulwark not only for defense and expansion but also for the aspirations of the Jesuits to evangelize in the region. So for 3 centuries, as you mentioned, it stood as a Jesuit home base that sustained missions in the region. But ironically, in the turn of the century in the 1900s, during American control, this would drastically change. After the establishment of Masjid al-Sangay in Zamboanga, the city began to develop an alternate character, second to being the Catholic bastion of the South. It actually became the center of Islamic scholarship that welcomed Malay and Arab missionaries, notably the Sakularans, who were from Palembang in Sumatra, and the Bederis, who were from the Hejaz in Saudi Arabia. So after being a Catholic bastion for 3 centuries, it became an entrepot for Muslim missionaries. The city would later cater to the earliest Moro protests for self-determination that led to the Zamboanga Declaration in 1934. So I would say Zamboanga has a dual character that keeps on changing, reflecting a push and pull between communities, which is actually apparent in these reflections on your presentation.
Okay, so let's take one more question.
Thank you. Amplify my voice. Is it clear? Can you hear me?
Sorry, can we have her first?
Hi.
Okay. So yeah, my question is actually more related to like the work that you are doing. Is probably is also related in the Zamboanga reflections when we say war, commerce, and faith. And by faith at the time, we are
also probably looking at, education systems, particularly the madrasas in Mindanao, or back then they called this, maktabs and bandita. But at the same time, I'm just curious about the Spanish perspective on the depictions of how do they describe schools, most especially like back back in this time frame, even up until now, like the line between education, like schooling system from an Islamic worldview, or even from like the Christian point of view. It's we claim to have secular education now, but still greatly influenced by Catholic teachings, or like the Christian, the Judeo-Christian tradition. And how do we? I guess my question is more on like how do they describe Spanish? How, from the Spanish perspective, how do they describe the education system of the morals that they encountered during those times? Thank you.
And one last question.
Hello, I'm Jay De Los Santos, history student. I actually have 4 questions. Is it okay? Okay, so first would be, what was Combe's reaction or position regarding the 1663 abandonment of Zamboanga? Did he oppose from it, especially that he was actually there doing missionary work? So what was his reaction? And second, you discussed about diplomacy, trade, and religious encounters, but where do women appear in these processes? Do Spanish sources, especially the Chronicas, reveal any instances where women acted as mediator or cultural brokers in these colonial encounters? And third would be, what roles did non-Moro indigenous communities, like for example the Sobanos, play in the making of colonial Zamboanga? Were indigenous communities only caught between competing powers, or did they also negotiate alliances? And lastly, I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but moving beyond the common binary Spanish versus Muslim, or the Moros, and knowing Sulu and Maguindanao, sultanates exercise their own forms of regional power and territorial influence, should they be viewed as competing states or rivalries also over Zamboanga? That would be all.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's enough to. That's a lot of questions. So maybe our speaker can answer.
First question?
The first question.
There you go. Okay, let me see. Your question was related to the 20th century. So that's not really my field of investigation. However, I would understand that Islam was I think it's really a question of timing, what time you're looking at. I've been showing you the time between the 16th and the 18th century, and already there you've seen a lot of changes going on. A change from slightly Islamized region to a Christianized part with Lumad parts as well. Then the Spaniards abandoned the place and Islam became stronger there. The Spaniards came back, made it more Christian again. So I think it was there in form. So when you're telling me now in the 20th century Islam got stronger again, I'm not surprised. I'm totally not surprised. On the contrary, for me it's a part of a very natural development actually. And how it goes abroad, I think that you know much better than I. And where it comes from, I think is very interesting. And also where the trends come from. So via Manila, the Catholicism, and this over like 300-400 years, and the Islam comes from the other side. So it's interesting to see that. As I said, not as singular positions, these against those, but seen in the context. And the Islamic context of the southwest of South Asia is strong, as you very well know. So I think it's no surprise that Islam came back. That's just my idea to that. In regard to schooling systems, not a lot. I don't. For the time I'm investigating, really not a lot. The Spanish schooling system consists basically in teaching the gospel, not much more. And the time does not capacity for that, especially the time when the Jesuits went away and the Recollects came there. They were like very few people on there, very few people on there. Jesuits were more, but still it was impossible to do any education. In regard to the perceptions on the Muslim education system, I don't think that there's a lot that has been said in the sources, in the chronicles. You would have to go for maybe Ignacio Alsina and to look for really old, very dense descriptions. What we have sometimes are observations in regard to the very high social levels. So, for example, when we have Kudarat and observations that Lopez was talking to his son and to his wives. So we have something, we know something, that they know dances, that know Arabic, that they learned about Islam, that Azimuddin himself, for example, as a young man, he traveled to Batavia and to other places and learned about Islam in several places. We learned Pandita is the word, I think. So sometimes we have comments on these education of these princes, the Paglimas, of Datus. Sometimes we have information on that, but on a big basis, I would say we have not an awful lot. And out of the sleeve, I would not be able to tell you what it is. But I think if you look for it, you would find bits and pieces. Sorry to not be able to tell you much more about that. And I think now we have like 3 or 4 more questions I have to answer. Diplomacy and women. I found situations in which the Sultana was, and okay, where are you? I can see now. There you are, it's okay. When the Sultana was involved in negotiations. For example, Alejandro Lopez came back to Kudarat to renegotiate the peace contract, and this ended horribly because in the end Lopez was killed, so he became a martyr for the Jesuits. However, during the audience, he was there and he was confronting Kudarat with some accusations and hard words. And somehow later we got information that if the Sultana would not have been there, the Sultan would have killed him right away. So also there we have some intermediary power of a woman. And I remember also during the same time, I think in the middle of the 17th century, that there was a civil war, or at least a quarrel between family members going on in Jolo. And also here it was a Sultan, I don't know, a Sultana or a Haidatu lady that was involved in the Soviet conflict together with the Jesuits. So at some points, when you look for it, I think as well, you can find women involved in these diplomatic efforts. The question was about the Lumad role, right? What the position? I wouldn't say they were in between. I would say it's much more complicated because who is Muslim? I don't want to make this debate today, but like only in the 17th century, because Combes said the Muslims in the Yaka and in Basilan were very strong Islamized, while the Bajau by far not so much. So I think it's a very gray area. So where's the Lumad start and the Muslim end? It's a very different thing. I wouldn't say they're crushed between sides. I would say they were practical and had their own belief system, which was very separate. So it's, again, much more complicated than that. And Spanish-Muslim competing states, in regard to sovereignty, for example, it's very difficult to say what was sovereign, but these negotiations in the 17th century, I would say they were pretty much getting to the direction of between two sovereign states. And finally, last question in regard to Combes' reaction to the abandonment of Zamboanga and most of Mindanao from the Spaniards. He wrote that book. The book was the reaction, and the book was a strong statement of, please, let's go back. We can't abandon our Christian friends there. We have to come back right away. And I did live to see it when he came back, because it would take 55 years. So that was his reaction to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kirelsheim. Last call, last question. Maybe we have one more question in the audience. Okay, if not, thank you very much, Dr. Kirelsheim, for your very stimulating discussion, and I am sure our audience was very engaged. And at this point, we shall now have the awarding of certificates and tokens to our speakers. So let me start with our reactors first. So let me read the citation. So Certificate of Appreciation, UP Asian Center and UPBSG. This certificate is awarded to Dr. Maria Cecilia D. Medina for serving as one of the reactors for the lecture, Reflections on Zamboanga, War, Commerce, and Faith in the Spanish Frontier Region, 1635-1805, held today, June 18, 2026, at the seminar room UP Asian Center, signed by the Dean of the UP Asian Center, Dean Noel Moratilla, who I should call also to award the certificates, as well as Dr. Jocelyn Celero to award the certificate as well. Okay, the same certificate is awarded to Shariful Hashim Mansour. And finally, to our speaker for this afternoon, let's give him a warm round of applause, Dr. Eberhard Kirelsheim. Thank you very much, Dr. Kirelsheim, to our reactors as well. And at this point, to deliver the synthesis, including and concluding remarks for this afternoon's lecture, may I invite the Assistant to the Dean for External and Cultural Affairs and Professor of the UP Asian Center, Dr. Jocelyn O. Celero.
I don't really have a thin synthesis. I want to be personal with this. Well, first of all, thank you so much for dropping by, Dr. Kirelsheim. I know you just came from a conference, Trans-Pacific, at the neighboring College of Arts and Letters. Friend, Dr. Marlon Salas, is also a colleague who's also collaborated, I think, in some projects with us. I learned a great deal from your lecture. Thank you very much. By the way, I am a daughter of Zamboanga. I'm a Zamboangueña. I was born and raised until 4 years old in Katipunan. It's a town in Zamboanga del Norte, so I'm from the northern part of Zamboanga. So when you talked about Zamboanga, mostly I think it's more of the center, the city to, well, Malambangan, of course there were other parts, Siocon, I'm familiar with those parts, but pretty much, and oftentimes the narratives that the mainstream Filipino society is familiar with is in the city proper, in the southern part. So I'm coming from the periphery, you know, where not a lot of stories are known. I'm also partly Sabano, so my father is a Sabanin, and I'm on 1/8 Lanam, so I am a byproduct of intercultural encounters. And I'm here at the Asian Center, where I teach Philippine Studies, and we have courses here at the Asian Center, notably the PS215, which is 216, which is a course on Filipino intercultural encounters, where we tackle a lot of the influences of the blending, the clash, the interactions, exchanges between these different civilizations. I mean, including, of course, our colonial experiences with Spain, US, and I think I remember there was one unforgettable question towards the synthesis of the course of PS216, where I asked my students, which among our colonizers impacted us the most in terms of identity? Is it Spain because we were colonized for more than centuries, for more than 3 centuries? Or is it the US, shorter but deep in terms of building structures or systems for for us to become a self-determined nation state? And the class oftentimes gets divided. They don't know which ones really brought so much impact. And it required so much reflection on who they are now. They would reference their surname or the languages that they learned or the exposures that how immersed they are in the Filipino society. And one would say, I don't have a province. And this is not necessarily true. They just happen to live or they just happen to be born and raised in Luzon. And they don't have a province, meaning because they don't speak other languages other than Filipino or Tagalog. And they envy other Filipinos who were from the South, from other parts of the Philippines. Yes, we do have students like that. And incidentally, these are students specializing in Philippine studies. And they say, oh, I'm not so Filipino because, I don't have so much diversity going on in me. So that's where the sentiment comes from. And I guess hearing your lecture today really made me think that when it comes to the experiences of Zamboangueños, people of Zamboanga, I feel so much more of an outline, or it kind of deepens, the peripheral position of the Lumans and the people from the northern part of Zamboanga. Yeah, it kind of reinforced that. We're not part of the story. A few months ago, I came across a website that I don't know how legitimate that website. I'll try to send it to you to verify, but the website shows that the Subanes form an independent autonomous kingdom. And they have their own lords, that they have their own symbols that the national government or even maybe the Zamboanga Peninsula has yet to recognize. But they don't need validation or affirmation whatsoever. They have their own story, they have their own history, that they can, that they don't necessarily need to attach to the mainstream historical narrative. So all of these, I think, points, I learned so much about Zamboanga's transformation because of the very complex functions that he played back in the day, being a military, a missionary, and a diplomatic bulwark, frontier, as you said. But at the same time, it doesn't speak entirely of all of the region. And I guess this is also reflective of how the Philippine history has been written. There's so much other narratives that we're excluding, that are yet to be known, that are yet to be told, that are yet to be shared. And that's the only time that we can more meaningfully, more deeply appreciate who we are as a nation. But thank you so much for reminding us. I feel proud and shameful every time there's a non-Filipino in our midst, knowing so much more than our own country and our own history. But we all have so much appreciation for all the work that you do. And yeah, all the best in your scholarship. And in terms of, sharing this to our Philippine Studies classes, I hope you can share with us your articles so that I incorporate them as I'm going to teach the course on Filipino intercultural encounters, and even Filipino identities. Because I always tell this to my students, Shariful, one of them, that we don't need to be alienated, frustrated all the time about our colonial experience. I think we all have to, that's part of who we are. That's part of our selfhood and nationhood. And all of these narratives, when they come together, we truly appreciate and accept them. Then we truly accept who we are. So with that, muchas gracias. Thank you so much for coming to the Asian Center. I hope this is not the last. And I hope you continue to be, sharing your work with us, not just with Dr. Lopez, our dear colleague. So thank you so much, and have a pleasant afternoon to all of you. We hope to see you in all of the future upcoming events. And speaking of activities, let me just announce that tomorrow we have a symposium in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the friendship between Japan and another colonizer, Japan and the Philippines. It's gonna be at the GT Toyota. Free food, lunch, snacks, certificates of participation if you actively engage, just like what you did today. And we hope to see you there. Tomorrow. If you're still here, please join us tomorrow. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Celero. And before we go our separate ways, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Kilsheim, for that very interesting discussion and lecture. Thank you very much to our actors, Dr. Medina and Mr. Mansul, and to your active participation, our audience for this afternoon.